This program is brought to you in association with First National Bank of Botswana.
FNB, how can we help you?
Welcome to First Issues. On tonight's program, we discuss in-house company secretaries and their roles, a role considered a critical channel between the board, the shareholders, and the company to ensure that the company is directed and controlled in line with a set of policies, processes, procedures, and rules. This all seems pretty straightforward until you remember the debacles that happened here locally involving company secretaries, company boards, and managing directors. As straightforward as it may seem, in-house company secretaries often find themselves on very thin ice within their places of employ. You see, at most organizations, in-house company secretaries are appointed by the board of directors, which includes the managing director. After the appointment, the in-house company secretary then works mostly with the managing director, but still answerable to the board, which creates a little pickle for them. A case, if you will, of the impossible task of serving two masters. More often than not, this situation ultimately culminates in a circumstance where, if the board were to dismiss the managing director, then the in-house company secretary would be let go of as well, by virtue of the close relationship developed over time working together with the MD. Our guest tonight is Sipho Showa, who is on the program in his personal capacity, having more than 15 years of experience as a company secretary. He writes in an excerpt, quote, "A long time ago, Julius Caesar decided to divorce his second wife, Pompeia, on the basis of suspicion. Caesar famously said that any wife of his must be above suspicion. Pompeia stood no chance because this is indeed a remarkably high standard that is near impossible to attain. More often than not, in-house company secretaries find themselves in this invidious position." Coming on the heels of that, this interview aims to highlight some of the unpleasantness that comes with being appointed an in-house company secretary, some pockets of unfairness, and maybe possible solutions to some of the problems that in-house company secretaries may find themselves in. Sipho, thank you so much for coming on First Issues and affording us your time. It's a pleasure having you on our platform. We're talking today about in-house company secretaries, their experiences and exactly what the role entails. Perhaps you could start off first by you telling us how you became a company secretary. How did it all start?
Well, I had moved from a previous employer to the next one, to take up what was largely going to be a comms PR role. But when I got to the new role, I was then told that we would also like you to take up the role of a board secretary, which was a completely new world to me. So I had to start getting to grips with what the role entailed. So that's how I then transitioned into the company secretarial / governance type of role.
At the outset of your appointment, what were your expectations or understanding into this post? I mean, you must have had some sort of, preconceived idea of what it meant.
The first thing that came to my mind was that I would basically be taking records of meetings, but it subsequently dawned on me that the role is much broader than sitting down in meetings and taking down records. It also involves advising the board on governance issues, which entail the law as it applies to the running of companies, either national laws or international law, and also delving into corporate governance principles as outlined, for instance, in King 4 and similar protocols. So it is a lot broader than that, including liaising with shareholders, making sure that returns are submitted on time, just basically being the custodian of the legal and corporate governance side of the business, and being the custodian of the company stamp, and making sure that all the various signatories right across the value chain are the correct ones.
In your 15 plus years of being a company or an in-house company secretary, what were your allegations and what did you do to stay secure?
Well, the role of a company secretary is a very challenging one, in that you have this duality to it, where you report to the board in relation to board matters, but on the management side, a company secretary then reports to the managing director or the chief executive. So one has to strike a balance between the two and make sure that they are trusted by both parties. And in order to do so, one, you have to be efficient at your job. Two, there has to be a very high level of integrity that you exhibit for both these parties to be able to work with you efficiently and in a constructive manner. So that's basically how one stays secure, if I may put it that way, in that role.
Sipho was an in-house company secretary for 15 plus years. At this point, he shares particularly difficult instances that he experienced within this role.
Well, I think broadly, if you have a situation where there is some sort of conflict between a managing director or a CEO and the board, and you are caught in between, then it becomes very challenging for a company secretary, because what then happens is that trust becomes the currency in that particular situation. We had a situation in the previous year where there was a dispute between the board and management with regards to the running of a general meeting of shareholders, where the board, for instance, felt that it should have had a role to play in making certain decisions that were going to be placed before shareholders. And then management said those were operational matters, which in the main would have resulted in a conflict of interest, because certain board members were also going to be considered, for instance, for reappointment to the board at the time. So it was going to be an anomaly to have a situation where people whose fate was going to be decided by shareholders wanted to have a view on whether that matter should go before shareholders and in what form. So that resulted in a number of cases which were widely reported upon by the press, with a view to coming to a middle ground as to how those matters should be dealt with. And the ultimate conclusion of those cases was that the decision on the items in the agenda had to be left to shareholders. So what you then have is a situation where even if a court decides or gives direction as to how matters should be dealt with, it is ultimately shareholders who make the decision as empowered under the Companies Act at a duly constituted meeting of shareholders.
In an article that Sipho wrote, he states, open quote, company secretaries always have to tread a very thin, perilous line and so must have a superabundant capacity for being imaginative on the spot, given the immense perplexities that they have to deal with. Many in-house company secretaries have on their faces and emotions the scars of ill usage, for they are forever in the crosshairs. Close quote. We ask, why do in-house company secretaries find themselves in this position?
Well, I think it goes back to what I said earlier, that because of the peculiarity of the role, where an in-house company secretary basically has two masters, being the board and their MD or CEO, they have to be seen by both parties to be a fair referee when it comes to dealings that affect both parties. If it so happens that one party is of the view that you are biased towards either, then your life becomes quite a challenge. So you always have to make sure that when you give advice as a company secretary, palatable or unpalatable, that particular advice, it is objective and you can back it up either by referencing the Companies Act or the various governance documents that the business relies on from a governance point of view. It might happen that you will give advice which the other parties don't like, but if it is what it is, then that is exactly what it is. So in addition to relying on these documents, one has to have a very strong EQ as a company secretary. Because there is a lot of emotion involved, mostly, when you deal in such relations. So one has to be careful as to how they navigate those relationships. Otherwise, they find themselves in a lot of trouble.
You advise that a thorough company secretary will check in first with the boss of the office, this being the managing director or the chief executive officer, if something that the board needs done should be done. But if the board were to rain hellfire on why that ask was not actioned, the responsibility lies with the in-house company secretary. So why are you of this view?
There is a distinction in the roles that the board plays and that which management plays. The board deals with governance issues, with making sure that the company is healthy, principally from that perspective. And it has to be deterred from delving in operational matters. So you do find a situation where boards are unable to distinguish between their role and the operational roles that are set aside for management, because the Companies Act or a company constitution might say the board has the ultimate responsibility for the running of a business. And that is often misinterpreted to mean that the board can delve in operational matters. So as a company secretary, you then have to evaluate a request that comes from a board. If they want a particular thing done, you then have to evaluate to say, no, but this, for instance, you can't get involved in because it is reserved for management. Take, for instance, the hiring of staff. There would be roles, for instance, in a board charter, which says a board must be involved in when they're hired. For instance, the head of internal audit, the company company secretary and maybe a chief operations officer. Okay, a board might then say, no, but we are allowed to get involved in the hiring of these people. Why can't we be involved in the hiring, for instance, of a finance manager? Then you say, but a finance manager is lower than a chief finance officer, so you can't get involved there. So those are the kinds of things that you then have to advise on and say, look, you are stepping over the line, step back.
Typically, if a board were to express displeasure towards a managing director or a chief executive officer and then decide to dismiss them, the in-house company secretary goes with them too. Seeing that this is a role that requires high levels of integrity, in-house company secretaries who've been dismissed find themselves with little to no job prospects in the future. How then does SIPO propose a mechanism that can protect in-house company secretaries should they find themselves in such thorny experiences?
Well, it's a very difficult situation to be in. As any in-house company secretary would tell you, my view is that when there is that kind of situation between a managing director or a CEO and his or her board, and the board is asking for guidance from the company secretary must provide objective advice on whatever pertains to the dispute between the two. Now, you will find in some cases that then there might be a situation where the board is suspicious of the advice that it is being given, and it thinks the advice is intended to favor the position of a managing director, of a CEO, or a situation where the CEO is of the view that the advice that you are rendering to the board on that particular dispute is not the correct one. So my take on such a situation is that you provide your advice. If they take it, they take it. If they don't, that's another matter. If it so happens that you are lumped together with the CEO or the MD, I think there has to be protective mechanisms for the company secretary, just as there is, for instance, a head of internal audit. Since the company secretary deals with governance issues, my view is that there has to be a process where a matter on the disciplinary process for a company secretary can weave its way through such that one is able, for instance, to present such an issue maybe to a body of shareholders to say, this is what transpired, because shareholders are the owners of the business and are interested in making sure that it is run properly from a corporate governance point of view, to say, this is what happened. And they can then exercise their minds, whether you were in the wrong or you were right, and what action should be taken against you. Alternatively, to avoid a situation where, for instance, a managing director would then constitute a panel, a hearing against you as a company secretary, when he or she is a conflicted party, such a dispute would have to be referred to an independent body outside of the organization to look at whether you would have done your job correctly or otherwise as a company secretary. Otherwise, you have a situation where you might get dismissed without having been given a fair chance in a fair environment for your matter to be considered. And then your next employer or potential employers have this perception that you might have failed to do your job thoroughly as a company secretary.
What do you think, or what do you purport to be your greatest takeaway, having been in this role for so long?
It's a whole range of issues. It's an exciting role to be in because you are basically at the center of power insofar as the running of the business is concerned. But you also then have to have the sense that that proximity to power doesn't go into your head to a point where you now start thinking that the world revolves around you as a company secretary, and everyone now has to run to you for this or that. So that's one bit. It also has taught me that integrity is very critical in this role. Discretion is key as well. And having the trust of both your bosses in the form of the board and in the form of the CEO is critical to your success as a company secretary, in addition to knowing your Companies Act, the governance documents or charters that run you through this function, and experience as well, and learning from past experiences, which then helps you, of course, to confer with other colleagues in the industry, to compare notes, to guide one another as to what to do in certain situations, because not one day is the same as the others. Yeah, all sorts of things are thrown at you on a daily basis, which are different. So you have to be able to have the experience, the knowledge, the skill, the patience to be able to deal with those issues. Otherwise, you'll go crazy.
This program was brought to you in association with First National Bank of Botswana.
FNB, how can we help you?